like I said, I'm very happy to be here again today. We had a really nice session about a year ago down at the park. I think it began with a power outage, so that was pretty exciting, and hopefully that won't happen again today. But I'm just delighted to be with all of you, and I'd like to thank especially Molly for inviting me back again this year, and also for all the things that Travelers Rest Connection does to improve the experience of the park. And my family and I are frequent visitors down there, so we really appreciate both the interpretive and the natural aspects of this incredible resource right near our home. And speaking of home, I am living in Missoula, Montana, and you'll get plenty of evidence for that today. Now, if you were not able to hear me last year, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to do that through the PowerPoint presentation that I put together for today. And I hope that Molly let me know if that's not coming through. But
nope, it looks good.
As many of you know, I am basically a children's book author for my career. I began writing, more than 30 years ago, and my very first book, Sea Snakes, came out back in 1993, which I cannot even believe. Since that time, I've gotten to write about a lot of different things and in a lot of different formats. I write picture books such as Teeth, and older kind of middle grade science books such as Sneed Collard III's most fun book ever about lizards, and even have written some middle grade and YA novels, a lot of them having to do with dogs, as you see there. All through my career, though, I've kind of gone back to an interest in birds. I wrote a picture book called Beaks about 20 years ago that actually turned into one of my best-selling books, much to my great surprise. And then, let's see. Okay. And then wrote a book called Birds of Prey, a look at daytime raptors, and even a YA thriller called Flashpoint, which was inspired by our very own Kate Davis, who started Raptors of the Rockies here in Missoula. I didn't really start to learn birds, though, until about 7 or 8 years ago. And two things, I think, pointed me into the direction of becoming a more competent birder. One is that I began researching and writing a book called Firebirds, which is all about professors Dick Hutto's really amazing research on how important burned forests are to birds and other animals. And while I was researching this, I of course had to go get photographs of these birds, and I decided I wanted to start learning them more in depth, and would often take my son Braden, who was about 11 at the time, out with me. Around the same time, though, we as a family watched a movie called The Big Year. Raise your hands if you've seen The Big Year. I know I can't see you raising your hands, but I will just let you know that if you haven't seen this, you should go watch it. It's just a really charming movie about 3 fanatical bird watchers who go out, try to set the record for how many birds they can see in a single year. And we just loved this movie. And afterward, my son Braden turned to me and he said, "Daddy, we should do a big year." Well, that turned into the first of several big years that we did. Different kinds of big years too. The first serious big year we did was just around Montana mostly, but then we branched out and went to Arizona and Texas and Florida. And this past year, in fact, we did a big year of Montana, which was just really great. And I'll probably mention that a little bit later. Not surprisingly, though, our increasing interest in birds led to a lot more bird books that I wrote, including one of my favorite books I've ever written, Woodpeckers, Drilling Holes and Bagging Bugs, which is the only humorous woodpecker book you're probably ever going to read. a picture book called Birds of Every Color, and even a memoir called Warblers and Woodpeckers, a Father-Son Big Year of Birding, which is actually an adult book, which I thought I maybe never would get around to writing in my career. So that's a little bit about myself, and that kind of indirectly brings me to the topic of what I'd like to talk to you mostly about today, and that is Lewis and Clark, but especially, well, I'll get to that. Lewis and Clark, as you all know, we are so lucky in Montana not to have to just read about Lewis and Clark through books or even watching videos, because almost literally everywhere we go in Montana is in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, whether we are hiking in the Bitterroots or visiting the Great Falls of Great Falls, paddling down the Missouri River, or going to the McDonald's that Lewis and Clark stopped at on their way back from the Oregon coast. And just for historical accuracy, I have to let you know, there was no drive-through when Lewis and Clark actually visited this McDonald's, but they did have a paddle-through over here on the left, where there's a drive-through today. So we're super lucky to be able to experience all these Lewis and Clark places for ourselves. But we can't, we're not limited to just experiencing the places. We can also experience the nature and the artifacts that are left behind. By the way, this is a Lewis and Clark place, I think, that has not quite yet been discovered, but I'm waiting for it to be added to the Travelers Rest site as well. But one thing that was really amazing to me about Lewis and Clark is how many species of plants and animals that they either described or discovered. Now, of course, they didn't really discover them, right? Native Americans knew about all of these and made serious use of a lot of them before, but Lewis and Clark brought an astounding number of plants and animals back to Western science for the very first time. According to Wikipedia, in fact, which I don't consider the ultimate source on anything, but it can put you in the ballpark, right? According to them, Lewis and Clark either discovered or first described 174 species of plants and 134 species and subspecies of animals. And looking through the list, I was surprised to see that I have quite a few of these plants in my own yard, including golden currant that you see back here. In fact, when we moved into our house about 15 years ago, one thing I wanted to do was plant mostly native plants. And it's amazing how many of them were on Lewis and Clark's list, including golden currant. The tree here, not the bird, that's a downy woodpecker, of course, but the tree is a bur oak, which I believe is the only native oak that we have in Montana. It grows mostly in the southeastern part of the state, but will grow in Missoula. In fact, we planted 4 of them in front of our house when we moved in. And of course, most people's favorite Lewis and Clark plant description or discovery, the bitterroot, right? In fact, this flower is named Lewisia rediviva. Rediviva, yeah, I think I got that right. And this was first collected by Lewis and Clark right near Travelers Rest in the Bitterroots. So we have a lot of connection to our state flower here, which is the bitterroot flower. Now, the list of animals that Lewis and Clark came up with is no less impressive. As I said, about 134 species are listed just on Wikipedia. They include grizzly bear. In fact, no European apparently had ever seen a grizzly bear before that Lewis and Clark saw them out on the prairie. But many, many other animals are on this list, animals that are surprising, like beaver and bison. They first described porcupines, white-tailed deer, the scourge of my own garden. I can't believe they were the first ones to come up with that description. And they probably described a lot more, but actually a couple of chests of specimens were lost as they were sent back to Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, I forget which. And I'm sure that they probably also contained things like this guy here, which I've seen running around Missoula. But I'm sure Lewis and Clark were the first ones to see it. Now, being a bird guy, I am especially interested in the new birds that Lewis and Clark discovered or described on their journey west and back again. In fact, their list includes about 60 species of birds that were unknown to European science. And again, many of these are quite astonishing to me. They include birds we think of as common, like snow geese, hairy woodpeckers. Gosh, really no European had seen a hairy woodpecker before. Wood ducks, which are back east now. And so it could be people saw them, but no scientist ever took the time to describe it. And even great blue herons. In fact, this picture I took in Pennsylvania, but these were unknown to official science back in Lewis and Clark's days. But what I want to do especially today is focus on two species that are credited with discovery by Lewis and Clark, and they happen to be the two eponymous species of Lewis and Clark. I love that word, forgive me for using it, but it means basically that the two species that were named after Lewis and Clark. The first one, oh, and by the way, if you're more interested in the plants and animals of Lewis and Clark, I highly recommend two books by local Missoula author Dorothy Hinshaw Patton. One is Plants on the Trail with Lewis and Clark, and the other one is Animals on the Trail with Lewis and Clark. I believe they're both out of print, but you should be able to find them maybe at the book exchange, for instance, here in town. Anyway, the two birds that I especially want to focus on today, first is this one. And raise your hand if you know what this bird is here. Well, this bird actually was named after Clark, who first saw this bird rather, on August 22nd, 1805. And it's named, when he saw it, he thought it was a woodpecker. But actually, this bird belongs to the corvid or crow and jay family, and it's called a Clark's nutcracker. And these are just some of the most wonderful birds we have in our area here in Montana. And you can see how it gets its name, the nutcracker here. It's got this great big bill used for tearing open seeds. And in fact, that's how it makes its living, is by feeding mostly off of the seeds from cones of conifer trees. Now, from this range map, you can see why Lewis and Clark were the first Europeans to discover these guys, right? Look at the range map here. They're mostly restricted to high mountain areas of the West. And so it's no surprise that not even trappers or anything had really made note of these animals before. Now, as I mentioned, these guys are specially adapted to pull out the seeds of cones. But what's really remarkable about them is that they seem to have co-evolved, or rather, several other trees have co-evolved with this bird. One of the amazing things about these guys is that they are able to store a bunch of seeds into a sublingual pouch here. And when the seed cones start getting ripe near the end of the summer, they just go to town. They just harvest thousands, maybe tens of thousands of these seeds. And here's the good part. They stash them or cache them in a lot of different places. And this is a huge benefit for cone-bearing trees because most cone-bearing trees rely on the wind to transport their seeds for them. But things like the white bark pine, limber pine, Colorado pinyon pine, they have their own seed spreader, and it's the Clark's Nutcracker. In fact, if you go out and you look at populations of these trees, you'll find them often in clusters. That's because the Clark's Nutcracker goes and plants a whole bunch of them in one area, and they all grow up together. So why doesn't it go back to get all the seeds? Well, my guess is it plants way too many or way more than it needs, or it just forgets about some of them. Now, the birds do have an amazing memory, in fact, to remember all of where their seeds are. In fact, I'm not sure if it's true of this bird, but other animals that cache seeds like squirrels, it's been shown that their brain, their memory parts of their brain actually swell during the times of year or grow during the times of year when they're planting things, and that's to help them retrieve everything. But anyway, this bird is just par excellent at, I made that up, that term there, at harvesting and caching these seeds. And you can see not only does it have a great bill and the sublingual pouch, look what it's doing to these pine needles here. It turned them into a branch by grabbing a bunch of them, because there aren't always branches for it to perch on when it's harvesting. And look, it just made its own branch. I just noticed this when I was putting the photos together for this show. By the way, if you have trouble finding Clark's nutcrackers, they tend to live high up in the mountains during the summer, but then they start migrating down in the fall. Our favorite place to see them is up on Mount Jumbo Saddle, but they can be observed in a lot of other places. My son Braden and I went birding yesterday, and we saw a couple of them. This fall, in fact, one birder at Maclay Flat saw more than 700 of these birds together, which was just mind-blowing to us. We'd never seen anything like that. So that's the first bird I really wanted to talk to you about today, Clark's Nutcracker. Now, I'll bet that some of you can guess what the second bird I'm going to talk about today is that was named after Lewis and Clark. Any guesses out there? Well, if you guessed Lewis's woodpecker, you would be correct. In fact, Lewis was the first European to ever observe, and I presume he collected, meaning he killed and stuffed or skinned one or two of these. And he saw his first one just about a month before Clark saw his first nutcracker in July. Oh no, I'm wrong about that. Wait, let me, oh no, I'm right. Yeah, so he saw his first Lewis's woodpecker on July 20th, 1805. And he did recognize right away that this was a woodpecker. In fact, he thought that it reminded him a lot of red-headed woodpeckers back where he lived on the East Coast. And that just shows you what an amazing natural observer he was, because Lewis's and red-headed woodpeckers are in the same genus, Melanerpes. And they share a lot of similarities. But the Lewis's woodpecker is different from all other woodpeckers. And I would love to tell you a little bit about that now. For one thing, you'll see it does share some similarities with Clark's nutcrackers. Its range is very close to the Clark's nutcracker range, except unlike Clark's nutcracker, Lewis's migrate. They breed in the summer here in Montana, for instance, but then they migrate south to better, warmer climes during the rest of the year. And some populations live where they live all year round. So what's different about these guys? Well, one is where you find them. I've seen them on fence posts before. I've seen them out in sage lands before, but where you mostly find them are places such as older burn areas, and more than anywhere else, where you'll find old cruddy cottonwood trees. Now, why is that? Well, my friend Dick Hutto, who helped me write Firebirds in my book Woodpeckers, and he's kind of a woodpecker guy. And when I was interviewing him, he kind of rated woodpeckers from hard to soft as far as what they like. The hardest head woodpeckers, or however you want to say that, are actually three-toed, black-backed, and hairy woodpeckers. And according to Dick, they can just bore into cement. Really, really hard trees, including fresh ones and freshly killed ones. If you go down a little bit, you get to downy woodpeckers, which are kind of intermediate. They can bore into fairly hard trees, but not super hard ones. And then you get to the bottom layer, and you end up with things like pileated woodpeckers, northern flickers, and more than anything, Lewis's woodpeckers, who really have trouble drilling holes in anything unless it's a soft, rotten, cruddy tree. Well, you can see this sets up a dilemma for them. In fact, their numbers have been decreasing steadily over the past century or two. And one reason may be pesticides. It may be hurting the insects they like to eat. But another reason is that when Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri River, there were just continuous galleries of forest, cottonwood forest, all along the rivers. This is what you see today. Well, what happened? Well, probably a couple of things. One is that the steamships on the rivers needed a lot of fuel, and they probably cut down most of these big, glorious stands of cottonwoods. But once the stands disappear, it's extremely hard for these trees to come back because of overgrazing by cattle and deer. And so as a result, you'll find Lewis's woodpeckers mostly in very defined locations. Our favorite place to see them around Missoula is out at Council Grove State Park. But you can also find them at Lee Metcalf. We've seen them at Kelly Island, but Council Grove has the most dependable supply, at least right now. In fact, it has at least a couple of pairs mating out there every spring and summer. Last summer, in fact, I took a couple of field trips with kids out there, and we had a great time looking at these birds. Now, if you do find them, I encourage you to watch them and see what they're doing, because one thing that really sets Lewis's woodpeckers apart, besides their preference for soft trees, is the fact that they don't actually bore into wood to get their insect prey. They are the only woodpecker I know of that actually fly catches. So they will sit on a perch and leap off of it to catch flying insects, as is shown by this great picture that Kate Davis allowed me to use for my book, Woodpeckers. And so these Lewis's woodpeckers are just amazing birds, and as are Clark's nutcrackers. And they're, I hope you can see why I wanted to focus on them in my talk today. Now, one thing that does disturb me a little bit is that we can't find Lewis's woodpeckers at Travelers Rest. In fact, Molly at the end, correct me if I'm wrong, but my son and I have never seen one there, and yet Travelers Rest seems like a perfect place to have Lewis's woodpeckers. You've got old cottonwood trees, some really nice natural areas. So I don't know if Travelers Rest, the association needs some new goals, but one might be to try to get Lewis's woodpeckers to move back onto the ranch, so to speak. I think that would really help complete the wonderful natural area that is out there. So that's the core of what I wanted to talk about today. But because all of us have been so cooped up for the last 12 months. If you're like me, you've got kind of a traveler's itch going on that is just not getting scratched. So I thought I would dive in a totally different direction to wrap up today and share with you the last big trip that I got to take out of the country. And I happened to take my son Braden with me on it. In fact, last year when I talked with all of you, we had just returned from this trip, and the trip was to Israel, where I had been invited to speak at an American school over there. A few days before the new year, Braden and I got on a plane. We had a long layover in Amsterdam, so we didn't sit around the airport. We took the train downtown. We saw some art by kind of a minor artist you've probably never heard of. I think his name was Van Gogh or something like that. I don't know. It's not important. What was important is that we got to do some birding while we were in Amsterdam for our layover in a place called Vondel Park. But only a few hours later, we found ourselves landing in Israel. This was not my first time to Israel. I'd actually visited there when I was 18, 42 years ago, at the invitation of the man on the right, whose name was Avi Lurie, and a great friend of my father's, and also a biologist. And when I graduated from high school, he said, you know, do you really want to go to college right away? Why not come spend a year in Israel? And so I didn't actually spend a year there, but I took off. I foregoed college for a while. And one of the great things about the trip was getting to reunite with Avi and his own son here, Barak, who was only 10 when I was there, and now his grandson, who's also a big biology lover like my own son, Braden. They took us all over the north for a few days. Here we're in the Hula Valley, which is world famous because about 15,000 common cranes spend the winter there. In fact, if you look closely, you can see these cranes behind us here in farmers' fields. But the Hula Valley is also famous because more than 500 million birds migrate through it on their way from Africa to Europe and Asia every year. So we, of course, loved seeing that. We went to the old city of Jerusalem, where you just have to go whenever you go to Israel. Really enjoyed a lot of the markets throughout Israel. And then we beelined down to the Red Sea, to the port of Eilat, where we went snorkeling, of course, on the tropical reefs there, visited a great place called the International Birding and Research Center, which is trying to restore a lot of the native habitat down there, and just saw amazing birds like the green bee eater, which is nothing like anything we have in North America. But probably our favorite part of the trip was after a couple of days in Eilat. We got up early one morning and we took a taxi to the Jordanian border. We went through visa and customs control, and then met up with a guide who took us to two places that I've always wanted to see. One was called Wadi Rum. Now, if you've never heard of Wadi Rum, or if you've never seen a movie in the last 60 years, I have to tell you, you might recognize it from movies such as Lawrence of Arabia, many of the Star Wars movies, and more recently, The Martian and the live action version of Aladdin. And I gotta tell you, you know, sometimes when you travel a lot, you can get a little jaded. Wadi Rum, though, was hands down one of the most spectacular places I've ever seen in my entire life. If you ever get a chance to go visit, please take advantage of it. And nearby is a place we saw the very next day, which is the ancient Nabatean civilization location of Petra. Now, Petra was built by these Nabateans who were just amazing navigators and traders, architects. I mean, it seemed like they could do anything. And they built this spectacular stone city right out of solid rock at a place called Petra. Unfortunately, we only got to spend a few hours there because it started snowing, which was the last thing we expected in Petra, and we were totally unprepared for it. But we got to see all these amazing sights. But of course, the whole time we were on this trip, we were paying attention to the birds. And if you travel and you pay attention to the birds, you might notice some interesting things. And one is that there are similarities in groups between our birds and birds in other places. One group of birds that especially interested me were the tits. This is a blue tit, a great tit, and a long-tailed tit. And just think for a moment, do these remind you of any birds we have here in North America? Well, if you thought chickadees, you'd be absolutely right. Tits are the chickadees of Europe and Asia, in fact, and they behave in a lot of similar ways. Sometimes they even sound very similar. So that was very interesting. Other groups we saw over there included one of my favorites, of course, woodpeckers. In fact, there's a story behind this one. Only 2 days after I arrived in Israel, I came down with the flu. And this was the real flu. I had a temperature of like 103 or so. And as I was lying in bed feeling sorry for myself, Braden burst in. He said, "Daddy, get dressed. There's 2 woodpeckers down the street." And I'm going, oh gosh, do I have to do this? But of course, since I love woodpeckers, I did. So I put on every warm thing I owned, even though it was only like 60 degrees. And I walked down the street, and sure enough, there were 2 Syrian woodpeckers. And I'm so glad that Braden made me do this because they were the only ones we saw on the entire trip. Other groups we share in common, kingfishers. We have the belted kingfisher here, but over there they have 3 different species in Israel. These stunning pied or black and white kingfishers, common kingfishers, and the most photogenic and cooperative, which were the white-throated kingfishers. In fact, their kingfishers inspired me to write a picture book about them. We have black-necked stilts. They have black-winged stilts over there. We have corvids like jays and crows. So do they, including one of my favorite birds, hooded crows over there, and jackdaws. You probably heard that name, jackdaw. I didn't know what it was before we started studying up on birds before the trip, but they're basically little tiny crows. But they also have bird groups that look a lot like our birds, but aren't. What does this bird remind you of? Well, if you said hummingbird, yeah, you're right in the ballpark, but these are actually called sunbirds, and this is a Palestinian sunbird. It behaves and looks very similar to our own hummingbirds, but is a totally different group of birds. Similarly with parrots. They have parrots, we have parrots. What's interesting about the parrots, though, is in Israel, like they are in the US, they are exotic species. They've been introduced. In fact, 2 species that we saw most commonly there, the monk parakeet and the rose-ringed parakeet, are parakeets that we saw in San Diego during a birding festival a couple of years ago. And I want to finish with 2 of our favorite birds of the whole trip. One is the national bird of Israel. It's called a hoopoe. And these live a lot like our northern flickers. They're not woodpeckers, but they probe the soil for ants, especially. And the other is the national bird of Jordan, which is the Sinai rosefinch. And you can see another really sublime but stunning bird that we saw while we were in Wadi Rum. So I hope you enjoyed that little introduction, maybe getting out of the country at least for 10 minutes while COVID persists. Before I turn it over to questions, I just want to mention that one of the great things about being in Montana is that we actually can get outdoors a lot. In fact, last year during COVID was a great opportunity for Braden and I to do a Montana big year. We put more than 5,000 miles on our car. We got more than 270 species of birds just in Montana. We never imagined, our goal was 250, and we didn't even think we could get to that. But Braden ended up with 274 species, including just, so many amazing birds that live right here in the state. Barred sparrow, upland sandpiper, black-tailed gnatcatcher. That's not right. This is oh gosh, Jeanette Larson. I know it's a gnatcatcher. Blue-gray gnatcatcher, there it is. Sorry, Jeanette, I was having a little brain seizure there. And of course, yellow-headed blackbirds. So COVID's gonna last a while. Why not take advantage of it? Get outside, explore, take the time to learn some of our amazing birds that we have here. Despite COVID, I actually do have 2 new picture books coming out this year. One that will be out next fall. It's called Beaver and Otter Get Along, sort of. This is not the final cover, so that's why the title reads differently. Really thrilled with this book and how it's came out, especially because of stunning illustrations by Meg Sodano. And in just 2 weeks, I have another book coming out, not surprisingly, about birds, yes, called Waiting for a Warbler. And this was inspired by my sons and my big year in 2016, where we got to go to a place called High Island, Texas, to see the warbler migration come through. And Waiting for a Warbler, which will be out from Tilbury Press, is actually a dual story. Half the story is about the warblers migrating from South America to North America each spring to breed. But the other half of the story is about this family who's been working to improve their backyard habitat, hoping that especially a cerulean warbler will show up to breed and nest right in their yard. And I won't tell you what happens. You'll just have to buy this for your grandchildren and read it out loud. Now with that, I would like to turn it back to our gracious host, and we can take some questions right now. So,
great.
Yeah, back to you, Molly.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Sneed. I don't know if everybody can do the little clapping hands in your reaction. That was great. And it's funny when the mute button is on, you can't hear our laughter, but there were a couple of outbursts here for sure, especially.
Why is that? I wasn't trying to be
maybe
funny.
Maybe it was a dinosaur running the marathon. That might have been it, but.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry about that. I guess I wasn't presenting it quite right.
Nah, you got it just right. But I want to actually ask a question from one of our participants. Dale Dufour is our resident volunteer and birder, and I wanted to ask him about if he would unmute and tell us a little bit about how often we actually do see Lewis's woodpeckers at the park.
I'd like
Dale,
to
are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. We do have Lewis's every year at the park. They used to nest here quite a bit, and their favorite nesting snags blew down one winter. They started moving into the cottonwoods, and the starling population has exploded, and the starlings are running them out of here. But they still come in. I see them every year, but they come here mainly to fly over Lolo Creek when we have an aquatic insect hatch and feed. But just a couple of years ago, we had a snag right next to the bridge that they nested in. I photographed them from the time they started working on their nest until the young were raised, and they fed them, and then they fledged. But that's been a couple years ago now. And this last year I did see them, but I never did see or find a nesting site.
Yeah, well,
Interesting.
starlings are a real problem, as you know. And similarly, out at the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, that should be a place where you find Lewis's too, but the starlings have really taken over the cottonwoods out there as well. So, but I'm glad to hear they're in the neighborhood, and at least they've got Travelers Rest on the radar if we can ever figure out a solution to the starling problems.
So are starlings a native species that tends to that kind of behavior, or are they? I mean, we talk a lot about non-native species of plants out here that overtake the habitat, but I'm curious if that's true of birds too.
Yes, starlings are basically a bird weed. And they were introduced into Central Park more than 100 years ago, and spread like wildfire throughout the country. And so they are an invasive, highly invasive species. And you know, it's too bad. It's funny, when we went to Israel and Europe last year, it was rare to see a starling, but that's their home turf. But once they got here, they either didn't have the diseases or the natural predators or whatever, and they have just been a huge, huge problem for about 100 years now.
Wow.
Molly, they are actually called European starlings.
Oh, there you go. So somebody had asked. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Do we know how
Somebody
they
has a
got
question?
here? Yeah, it's me, Marissa here. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, good. Do we know how they got here to begin with?
Well, all of these species get here in different ways. This one is kind of a horrible story. A very wealthy person in New York thought it would be cool to have all of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays living in Central Park. So he imported, I think, like maybe 20 different species. I'm not sure I have the number right. Most of them died out. And in fact, the first batch of starlings might have died out too, but they persisted and soon the starlings got established. House sparrows got established in a very similar way. And they, of course, are another really invasive species that is the bane of anybody hoping to have native birds at their bird feeders in the backyard. So yes, and so some birds got here by accident, but a lot of them are either escaped pets or they were purposely introduced early on.
So one of the questions that came up was in the chat was about how we could attract or keep Lewis's woodpeckers in the park. And it sounds like maybe the best thing that we could do is get rid of the starlings, but how, I mean, is that something that we can shy them away somehow, or we just have to hope that the Lewis's woodpeckers persist?
Well, Dale may have a better idea of that, but I read about all kinds of schemes for getting rid of starlings, and none of them seem very effective. People tried shooting them, they've tried poisoning them. When they tried to live in my roof, the only thing I could do was I blocked off the holes that they wanted to live in. And but that's obviously not practical to climb a rotten cottonwood tree and try to, you know, block the holes off. I really don't know. I think perhaps biological control might be a possible solution in the future, but it's really risky because you introduce a disease to a population like that, it might jump to another population, just as COVID did, obviously, oddly enough, right? So I really have not heard of any halfway hopeful solutions for starlings, but maybe Dale has, I don't know.
If there are any, they'd probably be illegal.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Sadly.
the main thing, though, is to make sure you keep having young cottonwood trees growing in the park, you know.
Mhm.
And we keep establishing new groves of cottonwood trees wherever we can. So.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, actually, for a lot of folks who may be joining us from across the country today. As Sneed pointed out, there used to be these cottonwood groves all along the rivers and creeks in Montana, and they're more and more rare. One of the great things about Travelers Rest State Park, and also you mentioned Council Grove State Park here around Missoula, is there are preserved cottonwood habitat here. And so we're fortunate to be able to see as many bird species as we do because this land is protected.
Yep.
Folks, you can also go ahead and add more questions to the chat if you want. If you have any, we'd love to hear some more. I do have another note sort of about that. Our Travelers Rest Birding, we have a new Facebook group. So if you are on Facebook, you can look up and join Travelers Rest Birding and see some pictures see or share pictures of birds that you take out here at the park. We'd love to see them. I know that just this week, Dale posted a picture of a couple woodpeckers. I'm going to say they were downy off the top of my head. Sneed, you shared some pictures of kingfishers from Israel, and oddly, Dale was able to take a picture of a kingfisher here at the park recently, which is a little out of season for those guys.
No, actually, they're here all winter. So at least in my experience, some of them may migrate, but I don't know much about that. The pileated woodpecker I showed you was taken at Travelers Rest, though.
Oh.
Yeah.
The kingfishers are here all year wherever there's open water. And Lolo Creek is normally frozen over. This year, right now, it's wide open, and that's probably why I saw one the other day and photographed it. The two birds I posted on that new website this morning were hairy woodpeckers. It was two males, and they were in their territorial dispute mode, which is not something they should be in January. But with this weather we've had, no telling what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Molly, I can't see any other questions. Do you want to feed me some if there are any others? Or?
So I'm not seeing any in the chat right now either. So folks, if you want to add them, there was, a lot of questions about bringing more Lewis's woodpeckers into Travelers Rest. I wonder, I know that there were some wonderful illustrations that Lewis did of different birds in the journals. And I'm wondering if in your sort of experience, I mean, we have the benefit of photography today.
Right.
But I know there's some folks on the call too who have part of the Audubon Society and have seen a lot of great drawing of birds. Well, I'm wondering, are there any birds that you haven't seen yet, or that that you've only heard described or drawn but haven't seen a photo of?
Yeah, thousands of them. I think scientists, there are about 10,500 described species on Earth, and I'm not even up to 1,000 yet, and so now I wish I had started earlier. If I had started in my 20s, I'd be at a couple thousand probably, but being the dumb young person that I was, I didn't start birding when I was a kid. So, actually, it really wasn't encouraged as much. I'm so happy now that so many more young people seem interested in birding than when I was a kid, Braden, of course, but he's got a good friend, Nick Ramsey, who grew up here in Missoula and just went to college at LSU. He's a fantastic birder. He's only 18. In fact, he's, I think, number 40 40th in the country right now in the number of species he's seen so far in 2021. And
Wow.
and kids just seem much more open to birds and more interested in them. And it's thanks to teachers, of course, and birders and bird societies, authors. We have another wonderful author, Jeanette Larson, joining us today, and she's written some incredible books about birds that I hope you guys check out. She's down in Texas. And so, you know, it's really great. And when you learn about birds and start caring about them, you really can't keep from caring about all the other great things around us, you know, because birds are such a linchpin, and they connect to the plants and the ecosystems and the water quality, and you can just make all these connections. And so it's a great lens to look at the world.
Yeah. I loved listening to you talk about the particular adaptations of the Clark's Nutcracker today. That's not something that I was familiar with, and how, you know, here's a bird that's designed to perpetuate its own food source. I think that's amazing, amazing.
It really is.
Bruce asked, what's your favorite spot in Montana to go birding?
Oh man, you know, just in the last year, we have discovered so many new places that we never birded before. Here in the Missoula area, we love to go to Nine Pipe National Wildlife Refuge. That's a terrific place to bird. And in all times of year, it's great up there. We also really like the gravel quarry near the soccer fields in Missoula. And we're so excited because this land at the gravel quarry just got officially donated to the city of Missoula. And Braden and I both have been putting some input along with many other birders about how to really enhance the bird habitat there. It's a great place to go birding. Elsewhere, we discovered a place last summer where I showed you the blue-gray gnatcatcher. It's called Bear Canyon, and it's down just to the southeast of Red Lodge. And so you go to Billings and drive an hour south and you're there. And it's an interesting place because it has this kind of juniper habitat, that sagebrush habitat that you won't find in a lot of the rest of the state. And as a result, you get some great birds there that you don't find anywhere else. But, you know, there really is not a bad place to bird in Montana, I'll tell you.
That's great. That's great. All right. Well, I think that was our last question in the chat.